when you look back on your body of work and your experiences with putting all these things into practice or communicating them to people, what do you think you got wrong, or what would you? Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Well, one that I have written about myself actually has to do with what is sometimes referred to as the model that I developed in Wilber 1. In other words, the first couple of books that I did. And what I was trying to do, the reason I actually got into those writing at all, but certainly writing those first books, is I was finishing my degree in graduate studies. It was in biochemistry. And I had just started to look at some other areas besides natural science in terms of any truth they might have or just what was going on. So there were things like Gestalt therapy that I had heard of. There was this thing, Zen Buddhism, that I had started to practice a few years earlier, having read Suzuki's books on Zen Buddhism. And I just really started a very sort of aggressive search through all of our various cultures, from pre-modern times to modern times to postmodern times, and in the East and in the West. And I was really looking for, something like an ultimate truth or an ultimate reality, or if that even made any sense. And as I was checking these areas out, and I was reading again some stuff that Eastern stuff, Western stuff, pre-modern stuff, modern stuff. And often, if there was still some sort of modern practice that was connected to it, then I would actually go out and try to find somebody who was teaching that. And I wanted to actually practice it. I wanted to actually try it myself. So I would have a more dependable idea about what that particular approach was like. And somewhere towards the end of that initial process, I just had a kind of a Satori-like experience, and we talked a little bit about it earlier in this conversation. But I had gone from thinking there was just one correct approach, and everybody else didn't have the correct approach, so they had the incorrect approach. World of opposites. So there's the true, and there's everything else that's false. And that changed from asking, okay, what's the one true approach versus all the others that are wrong, to saying, okay, how do all of these fit together? Because all of them have some partial degree of truth. And I knew that, and certainly for the ones that I had actually been practicing, because I knew I was getting something out of every one of those practices. There was some sort of truth in every one of them. And I couldn't just be convinced to throw them all over. I mean, I'd even run out and found somebody who was doing psychoanalytic oriented psychotherapy, and I was actually doing a type of psychoanalysis. So that just changed my orientation rather profoundly. I had not yet done a really in-depth study of developmental studies, developmental psychology. So I hadn't yet done that book, for example, that did an analysis of over 100 types of developmental models and found what they had in common. But what I was doing is I was working with levels as part of the framework that was helping to bring all these things together. Because that's one of the ways that I found could help fit things together. So I'll give you just a very brief idea. We talked about cleaning up, how you take a narrow and reduced psyche that's repressed some of its own shadow material, and then you unite that fractured psyche with that shadow. And so you make a whole healthy psyche. So that was one level, is you go from a small split mind, and then you unite that with shadow, and that would give you a whole and healthy mind. So that was one degree of wholeness. It was greater. During the 60s, there was a huge movement in psychology and psychotherapy that was known by a lot of names, but technically it was called humanistic existential. And one of the main claims that it made is that human beings often have this really bad split between mind and body. And they identify with the mind, and the body is just dangling along under them. And so a lot of these humanistic existential therapies would come up with practices where you'd actually unite your mind and body, and you get a whole healthy organism. So, well, okay, I bought that. I had tried some of those. They certainly seemed to work and to do that. So that was a bigger level of wholeness. So you take the broken mind plus shadow, get the whole healthy mind. Then you take the whole healthy mind, unite it with the body, and you get the whole healthy organism. That's even bigger. So that was another level. And there were levels between these things. And then the mystics all claimed that, no, you're not just this individual organism, that there's an experience where this individual organism becomes one with absolutely the entire world. And I'd go, well, that's a big, big wholeness. So that's going to go on the bottom. That's going to be the biggest. So then you go from just identified with a small broken mind to a whole healthy mind to a whole healthy organism to identified with the whole universe. And that was the whole, man, that was big. That was the ultimate level of identity we could have. Now, what came from that, well, and I that sort of hit me, that whole series of levels sort of hit me in a big insight. And so I wrote my first book using those levels. And the book was called, appropriately enough, The Spectrum of Consciousness. And the idea was that human beings didn't just have a consciousness, it was just at a level. And that's what was real. And you could work on that, do different things to it, and so on. But that we actually had a whole spectrum of levels of consciousness. And these varied from very, very small and broken to unbelievably whole and unified. And essentially, that's a correct insight. But the problem at that early stage for me is that I hadn't yet looked at how development itself moves. But by the way, I'd come up with overall, there are about 6 or 7 major levels. And then what I did is I went through, and next to all of these levels, I would give typical examples of the types of disciplines that worked with each different level. So you could see how all human knowledge fit alongside this big spectrum and all of that. And on balance, most of it was very solid and very good. And it was a very, very, relatively very new concept. And so it got just outrageous positive reviews. But the one area I hadn't directly dealt with was development itself. And since taking just this model on its own, we have this ultimate unity, and it's broken into a smaller unity, and then that's broken into a smaller one, and then that's broken to an even smaller one. Well, that would suggest that in terms of development, that's how development itself would go. It would go in those stages, because, I mean, how would it start with a smaller one and have these things happen? Or it certainly wouldn't start in the middle. So, but I noticed in that book, when I would write about something like the infant, the assumption would be, if our development is starting with this big wholeness, that the infant itself starts out one with everything. And so when I got to writing about that, I noticed that I would just sidestep that whole issue. And I just didn't deal with that. And so the model itself was, in essence, it was right. But in terms of some of the actual stages and then the direction that they would go, that would await Wilber too. And what happened with that is I started writing. I wanted to apply this model. I wrote, actually, the first book, The Spectrum of Consciousness, was a large, somewhat academic book. And so I wrote a very popular, accessible version of that called No Boundary. And No Boundary is still one of the best-selling books that I've done. And it's essentially okay. But here was the problem. I decided I wanted to take that 6 or so level model, and I was going to apply it to human history, human evolution, and show how that had all occurred. And I was going to apply it to human development and show how the same levels occurred as an infant, grew and developed. And the problem was, well, at first I didn't think there was a problem, because everybody at that time, everybody knew that the first 6 months or so of an infant's life, that it actually is one with its physical environment. It can't tell where its body stops and the floor starts. And Freud was aware of this, Piaget was aware of this. And it was just a type of fusion state. And so to me, that was pretty clear that was an example of this unity, this big wholeness. And then the infant would start breaking those down. First, it would separate its whole organism from the environment, and that would be the next level. And then it would, as it conceptually developed, it would separate its mind from its body, and that would be the next level. And then when it got shadow material, that would separate the broken, shrunken mind from the whole mind. So I thought that was all working fine. But then the more I looked at that first stage of development, which was supposed to be wholeness, the more it dawned on me that something was just not right about that. And so I started writing a book that was going through all the stages of human development, starting with this whole unity, and then going all the way through the emergence of a small psyche, which I call persona versus shadow. And then from there, we went into stages of meditation and enlightenment. And that was where it was starting to get problematic when you do that. But as I looked at that early infantile state, I was actually writing a book on that, and I'd actually written a chapter on that early state. And the book that I was writing was called The Outland Project. And what started to dawn on me was that there's something really off about those first few stages. That it was really hard to make that work. And so I thought, well, what I'll do is, I was going to do a book on human history. So I'll do that now. I'll go back and look at human history. And that'll help me figure it out, because you can see, adult human beings and what they were doing and all of that. But when I first went back and started looking at all the material, literally most of the really smart scholars at the time that also had a mystical interest, people like Norman O'Brien, or even people like Alan Watts, had maintained that the Garden of Eden was a real place, that in the Garden of Eden, we were one with everything. So they were telling the same story about, well, it all starts out with this absolute whole unified oneness, and then it got broken off and broken up and broken up, and we got smaller and smaller and smaller. And that started to make sense for me. But then I just ran across this one explanation about the Garden of Eden. And this person just used a couple of words. And they were, the Garden of Eden wasn't a transpersonal state. It was a prepersonal state. And that just hit me like a bolt of lightning. And I actually ended up, because of that understanding, the difference between pre and trans, I actually ended up writing a paper that had a very, very wide circulation, a huge impact at the time. And it was called the pre-trans fallacy. And what that is, it just said, if you look at any sort of mystical approaches to reality, what they'll often do is they'll just say, okay, there's rationality, that's bad, and then there's non-rational, and that's good. But they don't distinguish between pre-rational and trans-rational. And they don't distinguish between pre-verbal and trans-verbal. And pre-rational is not good. That really is just pure narcissistic, self-centric, and so on. Trans-rational, now that's good, because that transcends and includes rationality. So I went back and looked again at those early stages. And particularly as I read, for example, Piaget more closely, he actually said of that first stage, that fusion stage, he said the self is here material, so to speak. In other words, the self is identifying with just the material environment. It wasn't like in the Christian mystical version, the great chain of being, matter to body to mind to soul to spirit. The child wasn't identifying with feeling body or mental concepts or illuminated soul or ultimate spirit. It was just identifying with the material environment around it, and that's all it was. So that just flipped those early periods on their head, so to speak. And then actually looking at the more complete sort of chain of being that I had constructed by using Eastern and Western sources, you could see that human beings essentially started out in those lower stages and then progressed through all of these levels of growing up. So that was a big change for me. And even though, again, there's at one point, Shambhala Publications, which is who I've done a lot of publishing, is distributed by Random House Publications. And Random House has got the largest publishing and book marketing force on the planet. And they distribute all of these books. So it's really the best of all possible worlds. And Random House decided at some point, I don't know, 45 years or something like that they wanted to do collected works of Ken Wilber. And I immediately thought, well, that means I died, because you never do collected works until somebody's dead. But I finally said, okay, fine. So we brought the works together at that time, which are really only about 2/3 of my collected works, but it was done in 8 volumes, like about 2 books in each volume. So I went back and read everything that I had written. And all of those books are still in print, by the way, which is really kind of unheard of for that time. And I particularly was curious about the spectrum of consciousness, because it was the first thing I had written. I wrote it when I was 23 years old, and I hadn't really looked back at it carefully in a long time. And so I went back and read it really, really carefully. And what was so odd is that whenever I got to a point where I was just about to say something unbelievably false and really screwed up, because this model wasn't quite fitting the way it should. And so I was going to say something about, a 6-month infant is at a state of enlightened oneness, only it's in a pre-conscious fashion. It'll recapture that oneness in a mature adult form later on if it takes up meditation. Right when I would be about to say that, I would steer off it, and I wouldn't actually say something quite that bad. But it did leave a hole in the narrative, so to speak, because it really tended to pick the story of growth up at the persona shadow, this narrow stage of development. And that's really about halfway up what I would call the overall spectrum now. And the thing that I hadn't figured out was what those really earliest stages of human development were like. And this was a problem both because so many of the smart, mystically oriented philosophers that I had read bought into the fact that this early fusion state was indeed an enlightened awareness, just in an unconscious way, whatever the hell that meant. And there were very serious models being written that said exactly that, and claimed to be based on this work that I was doing. But I never had actually said that. And by the time I got to Atman Project, because I went back, and as I was doing the historical account of humanity, which was a book that I called Up from Eden. And it was given that name, Up from Eden, because Eden really was a pre-rational, pre-verbal, pre-personal state. And we didn't fall down from that. We grew up from that. And so both of these books were then absolutely fine and essentially stayed with the main central framework that I had presented ever since. But I was always surprised that I had essentially, in essence, even though I didn't use very many of these types of philosophers themselves, but I had essentially fallen into a version of romantic philosophy, that we really were in an Eden, and we really did go downhill from that point of view. And that's just not quite what happened. One of the things that did happen is that when we were in that pre-rational, pre-verbal Eden period, way back in so-called archaic to magic times, there wasn't a very strong separate self sense. So we didn't really have that sense of being isolated and separated from the world. We didn't have the sense that we had actually fallen as human beings. But as we got more sophisticated and moved up into the mythic stages, where you do start to develop a stronger sort of separate self sense or ego, then we start to get stories about humanity falling from a period where it was a heavenly, blissful state. And that was just looking back on the period, not where they were actually enlightened or awakened, but where they were just too pre-conscious to be aware of very much of this separate and horrifying pain of being a separate self-sense in the manifest world. Remember, even Buddhism maintains that the inherent mark of this manifest world is dukkha. It's inherently suffering. And that's what you get if you go around splitting everything up into opposites and trying to keep them apart, and you separate yourself apart from your ground of being, which is your own ultimate truth. Go around doing that a lot, and you're in for a world of hurt. So that was a big change for me. But it always surprised me that I had done that. So that's pretty straightforward in a sense.
What about the integral movement? Do you think that there are certain things that kind of either went wrong or could have been done better and maybe can still be done better?
Yeah, sure. One of, I want to put this politely. One of the things that can happen when a fairly developed individual first reads some of my books is that, and this is only, I don't know, maybe 10, 15%, a little more, a little less. It's not a huge number, but it's a significant number. It's because they haven't been exposed to a lot of these various areas of truth and their own potential for growing. They can become extremely excited about it. And the way they become excited about it is not the way a sort of a more fully and rounded, developed person would do it, but just somebody who has really sort of pushed their cognitive development into second tier, even though their self-sense and their moral development and so on might be much lower than that. But cognitively, they're pushing into this sort of integral second tier. And so they get very, very excited about this approach. And what they get especially excited about is the fact that they are at this vanguard of growth and development, even though they're not doing so well in other areas, and they might never have, and they don't care about waking up or anything like that. But they do know that they're at second tier, and that's the leading edge, and that's where humanity is struggling to get to right now, and that so many things are going to be better when humanity gets there, and so on. And all of that's true. But what's not true is that you're not necessarily a sterling representative of all this. And development, anyway, is certainly in growing up, and we just saw waking up gets more and more complex as you continue going into it. But it looks like right now that growing up can just sort of keep going. There doesn't seem to be an actual upper limit to that. So, I mean, if we look back 1,000 years ago, humans weren't all that developed in growing up. So where are we going to be 1,000 years from now? We're going to look back on us, or the super intelligent machines will look back on us, their forerunners, and decide that we're not that necessarily right. But what would happen is some of those types of people And then, and let me just say, so nobody reads into between the lines here, not the people that actually put on most of the integral conferences. I'm not talking about those people, but I am talking about the 15% or so that attended those conferences and thought that they themselves were, one of the great exemplars of this leading edge that we're all looking for. And those types of folks, they just caused problems as far as I could see. And I personally just wasn't very happy with how that was going. And so I myself never attended a single integral conference that was held in any of these other areas. And I never got on in a chat room or a discussion board where there were some of these types of people that were on it. And in most of the discussion, that you can always find a handful that were doing that. And so they were always sort of explaining to everybody how they should be acting. And they knew exactly how they should be thinking. And they knew exactly what the right thing to do was and whatnot. And I just found that really disturbing. That's really what an overall integrated, integral person, that's exactly what they're not going to do. And they really do lead with a certain kind of humility, and they're very good at gratefulness, and they're very good at forgiveness. And these are values that rank very high for people that are genuinely well developed. And again, there's in a certain sense, there's no reason to get braggadocio about maybe your cognitive development is second tier, because again, development can just keep continuing. So there's always going to be somebody who's at a stage higher than you are. And there's always going to be somebody that's had more waking up experiences than you have. So what you should really take away from a fully integral approach is, wow, there are more areas than I dreamt of that I can fail at. So I really got to get my act together. Look at all these places I can continue to grow. That's a good attitude to have. And how you're already there and already understand all that. Good Lord, I don't know anybody that fits that sort of orientation. But integral sometimes, and I think particularly from the sort of chat room conversations, it wasn't uncommon to hear that kind of criticism, is that, oh, well, they're all arrogant, they're all know-it-alls, and that kind of thing. And that was not at all anything that I had in mind for that sort of comprehensive approach.
Get our 50-page guide on adapting to the future. Sign up at futurethinkers.org/signup.
The brand new Future Thinkers members portal is now live. Develop your sovereignty and self-knowledge with our in-depth courses, get access to our weekly sense-making calls, join the Q&As with past podcast guests, and much more. Become a Future Thinkers member today at futurethinkers.org/members. To stay up to date with new episodes, subscribe to Future Thinkers on your favorite platform. And leave us a review or a like. It really helps out the show. And don't forget to share this episode on social media.